Okay, I am pleased to introduce to you Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman Paul was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He graduated from Gettysburg College and the Duke University School of Medicine before proudly serving as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force during the 1960s. Congressman Paul and his wife, Carol, moved to Texas in 1968, where he began his medical practice in Brazoria County. As a specialist in obstetrics and gynecology, Dr. Paul has delivered more than 4,000 babies. He and Carol who reside in Lake Jackson, Texas, are the proud parents of 5 children and have 17 grandchildren. Congressman Paul served in Congress during the late 70s and early 1980s. In 1984, he voluntarily relinquished his House seat and returned to his medical practice. Dr. Paul returned to Congress in 1997 to represent the 14th Congressional District of Texas. He presently serves on the House Committee on Financial Services and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Please welcome Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real delight to be here. I'm always glad to get into a crowd like this. It seems like I get more applause than when I'm speaking on the House floor. And this, of course, is a very important issue, not only to you and to me, but to the country and really to humanity and to our really where we're going as a people. It's an issue that I've thought about and worked on for a long time to try to come up with a precise position. And I put most of my thoughts into a little booklet here, which says Challenge to Liberty, Coming to Grips with the Abortion Issue. And it was written several years ago, and I wrote it both from a political viewpoint as well as a physician in obstetrics. But in the book, I tell the story that when I went to medical school in the late 50s and early 60s, the issue never came up. I never heard the word abortion. But by the time I got into my OBGYN residency in the mid-60s and late 60s, there were abortions being done at the University of Pittsburgh illegally. And I had not thought much about it. I mean, it was natural that we didn't talk about it because nobody was doing it. It wasn't a major issue. I was worrying about passing my courses rather than thinking about this profound issue. But one day I walked into an operating room to just be an observant, which we would do generally as a medical resident. And I walked in and they were performing this hysterotomy, which was a cesarean section. And they lifted out a fetus that weighed approximately 2 pounds, and it was breathing and crying. And it was put in a bucket and sat in a corner of the room, and everybody in the room just pretended they didn't hear it. And the baby died. And I walked out of that room a different person. I thought, this is not just a simple little issue. This is a major issue. And, of course, then that started me into thinking of the very details, medical and legal and all the ramifications. Because the 60s were a tough period of time. I did serve 5 years in the military. The Vietnam War was going on. There was moral changes occurring at that time. And the law was being flaunted on abortion. And I often thought that the morality came before the change in the law. We condemn, of course, Roe versus Wade, and we should get rid of Roe versus Wade. But Roe versus Wade is a reflection of the moral climate of the country because the law was being defied, and then the law was changed. The law sort of caught up with the culture. So even though we work in the legal area and we work politically, ultimately I believe it's an issue of personal morality and is a reflection of the country more so than just the lack of laws. we have just changing the law won't be enough. We will ultimately have to have a society that's moral enough to reject this position that the fetus deserves legal protection. To me, the best way to put this in proper perspective for those who aren't with us on the right to life issue is to make the distinction between 1 minute before birth and 1 minute after birth. And I believe that if this issue is not resolved in that precise area, we can't solve this problem that we're facing. 1 minute before birth, according to the Supreme Court, since they wrote the regulations in Roe versus Wade, in the third trimester an abortion can be done. And if I do it, if they come to me and I do an abortion, they pay me for it. But if 1 minute after birth, if the teenager who's delivered a baby and is frightened and understood that life has no value and she throws the baby away, she gets prosecuted for murder. And that has to be resolved. Of all the problems we think about, I do think about the other problems. I think about our problems in foreign policy, about the issue of war, the issue of spending, and the financial crisis. But I believe we eventually have to deal with the issue of life. I am a strong proponent of liberty, and I'm a strong proponent of privacy. Those who endorse the issue of having abortion argue it from the case of privacy. I think privacy is a red herring. It has nothing to do with privacy. The only issue that counts is whether or not the fetus is legal and human and deserves respect and deserves protection of the law. I know as a physician that I have that legal responsibility, and that is if I do injury to the fetus, if I give the wrong medication and do harm, or if I would inadvertently cause an abortion, or if one of you run into a car and a woman is pregnant and loses her child, you have legal liability. So there is a legal entity there. It's not like they can pass it off as a blob and it's irrelevant. Bernard Nathanson is a friend of mine, and many of you in here probably know the name, but he participated in over 65,000 abortions. He ran an abortion clinic in the 60s. He had a lot to do with getting the law changed. He defied the law. And you know when he changed his mind and became strongly pro-life? It's when the ultrasound came out. So there he was, getting ready to do these abortions and wanted to check on pregnancy, and he'd see a small fetus and see the heart beating. He no longer could do abortions. I had a physician friend that worked for me for a while, and he went off to another state where abortions were legal. They weren't at that time they weren't doing them in Texas. And he came back to visit, and he had been making a lot of money doing abortions. I said, "Doesn't it bother you to do the abortions?" He says, "No." And then he paused for a minute, and he says, "Unless I have to look at the fetal parts." And that's what we have to get people to do. They have to look at the fetal parts. They have to look at this issue as a real issue. I'm a great defender of privacy. I'm a great defender of all liberty. I want you to have a lot of leeway in making your own judgments on your personal habits and your personal religious beliefs. But if the issue of life is not resolved, liberty doesn't mean a whole lot. We have a Constitution. We have a Constitution and a principle embedded in our tradition that protects life and liberty. And life comes first, liberty comes afterwards, but the two go together. If we are careless with our liberty, we get careless with life. If we get careless with life, we get careless with liberty. And that is what has made America great. We had great concern about life and liberty. And it was magnificent because it was new and wonderful, different than the thousands of years of history. There was more respect for life and liberty in this country than ever before. But I would suggest to you that in the last 100 years, and especially since Roe versus Wade, we have lost the respect that we need for life and liberty, and I believe that is the reason our country now is in jeopardy, whether it's foreign policy, domestic policy, spending policy, monetary policy, because we have lost our love for liberty, we have lost our confidence that liberty works, that we have to have government, but we have to have government very limited to the protection of life and liberty. Thank you very much.